It is the winter of 1943. High above the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley, the night sky is a chaotic tapestry of flak tracers, searchlight beams, and the burning debris of 4-engine bombers. For the crews of RAF Bomber Command, this is the violent war. It is a war of 88mm shells, of Focke-Wulf 190 night fighters, and of shrapnel that tears through aluminum skin and flesh with equal indifference. It is a war of terror, noise, and adrenaline. But for the crews who survived this gauntlet, who nursed their crippled Lancasters and Halifaxes back across the North Sea, trailing smoke and leaking hydraulic fluid, an even deadlier enemy awaits them at home. It is an enemy that cannot be shot down. It cannot be jammed by radar countermeasures. It cannot be outmaneuvered. It is the silent war. It is the British weather. Specifically, it is radiation fog, a thick, impenetrable blanket of suspended water vapor that swallows the English countryside whole. In the meteorological logs of the time, it is recorded simply as visibility 0. To the exhausted pilot of a 30-ton bomber, running on fumes after an 8-hour mission, it is a death sentence. In 1942 and 1943, the Royal Air Force was losing more aircraft to accidents and weather than to enemy fire in certain months. The statistics were grim and unforgiving. A squadron might launch 20 aircraft against Berlin. 2 might be shot down over the target, but 3 might be lost on return, smashing into hillsides, colliding in the soup, or simply running out of fuel while circling an invisible airfield, forcing the crews to bail out over the freezing channel. The German Luftwaffe, with their own history of rigid technical arrogance, believed this was an unsolvable variable of war. They believed that when the fog rolled in, the mighty Allied air fleets were grounded. They believed that nature itself provided the Third Reich with a shield that no amount of American industrial capacity could breach. They were wrong. Because while the Germans were building better night fighters, the Allies were doing something far more radical. They were preparing to declare war on the weather itself. They were about to engage in an act of thermodynamic brute force so extravagant, so wasteful, and so technically audacious that it remains one of the greatest unheralded engineering feats of the 20th century. They weren't going to invent a better instrument landing system. They weren't going to wait for the weather to clear. They were going to boil the sky. This is the story of Operation FIDO, the Fog Investigation and Dispersal Operation, the system that turned British airfields into open-air blast furnaces, the system that consumed gasoline at a rate of 100,000 gallons per hour, creating a tunnel of fire visible for 60 miles, just to bring a single bomber home. It is a story of plumbing, pyromania, and the absolute triumph of logistics over the laws of meteorology. To understand the scale of the solution, we must first understand the scale of the problem. In the autumn of 1942, the Allied strategic bombing campaign was reaching a critical tempo. The arrival of the American 8th Air Force, flying by day, and the intensifying raids of RAF Bomber Command by night were intended to dismantle the German war economy around the clock. This was the round-the-clock bombing doctrine. But this doctrine had a fatal flaw. It assumed the aircraft could take off and land. Great Britain, for all its strategic advantages as an unsinkable aircraft carrier off the coast of Europe, is meteorologically cursed. The island sits at the confluence of warm, moist air from the Atlantic Gulf Stream and cold, dry air from the continent. When these air masses collide, particularly in the autumn and winter months, the result is a phenomenon known as advection fog. This is not the light mist of a romantic novel. This is the pea souper, a fog so dense that, according to contemporary reports, a man standing at the wingtip of a Lancaster bomber could not see the fuselage. It is a wall of white that diffuses light, disorients the inner ear, and renders standard navigation lights utterly useless. For a pilot returning from a raid, the experience was terrifying. Imagine flying a machine that weighs 65,000 pounds. You have two engines out. Your electrical system is shot. You have wounded men on board. Your fuel gauges are tapping empty. You know intellectually that your home base of Gravely or Fiskerton is directly below you. Your navigator, using the G radio navigation system, tells you that you are over the runway. But when you look down, you see nothing. Just a featureless gray void. You descend 500 feet. 300 feet. Still nothing. The altimeter in these early aircraft is barometric. It relies on air pressure. If the local pressure has changed since you took off, and it always has, your altimeter might be reading 200 feet when you are actually 10 feet off the ground, or 10 feet underground. You have two choices. You can attempt a blind landing, trusting your life to primitive gyroscopes and luck, a gamble that usually ended in a fireball of aviation gas and high explosives. Or you can obey the standing order for fog conditions. Turn the aircraft toward the sea, lock the controls, and bail out. Think about the economic insanity of that second option. A Lancaster bomber cost approximately £45,000 in 1943, money roughly equivalent to £2 million today. But the cost of the machine was negligible compared to the cost of the crew. A pilot, a navigator, a bomb aimer, a flight engineer, 2 gunners. These 7 men represented years of training, thousands of gallons of fuel in flight school, and an irreplaceable reservoir of combat experience. To order them to abandon a perfectly functional aircraft simply because they could unsee the ground was a strategic hemorrhage that the Allies could not sustain. The attrition rate was unsustainable. In 1 week in November 1942, Bomber Command lost more aircraft to crashes in England than they did over the flak-heavy skies of Hamburg. The Luftwaffe knew this. German meteorologists were excellent. They could predict the formation of fog over East Anglia with high precision. When they knew England was fogged in, the German night fighter force would often stand down or launch intruder missions to catch the Allied bombers as they circled helplessly over their home bases. It was a turkey shoot where the turkeys were blindfolded. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, a man who famously loved technological gadgetry and hated defensive thinking, demanded a solution. He did not want a navigational aid. He did not want a better radio. He wanted the fog gone. This demand fell onto the desk of the Petroleum Warfare Department, PWD. The PW was a strange, shadowy organization created in the panic of 1940. Their previous portfolio consisted of weapons designed to burn German invaders alive. They were the men behind the flame Faugas, roadside bombs, and the apocalyptic plan to set the surface of the English Channel on fire in the event of a seaborne invasion. They were not meteorologists. They were pyromaniacs with a government budget. The head of this department was Geoffrey Lloyd, the Minister for Petroleum. But the technical genius, the man who would essentially weaponize the concept of central heating, was a civil engineer named Arthur Hartley. Arthur Hartley was the chief engineer for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the precursor to BP. He was a man of the industrial mindset. He did not look at fog as a weather phenomenon. He looked at it as a thermodynamic equation. Hartley's logic was brutally simple. Fog is water vapor that has condensed because the air temperature has dropped below the dew point. To remove the fog, you simply have to raise the air temperature back above the dew point. If you heat the air, the water droplets evaporate back into invisible gas. The fog disappears. The math, however, was terrifying. To clear a volume of air the size of a runway roughly 2,000 yards long, 150 yards wide, and 100 feet high required an immense input of energy. You weren't just heating static air. You were heating air that was constantly moving, blown by the wind. You had to create a thermal barrier that could withstand the influx of new cold air rolling in from the surrounding fields. Hartley calculated that to raise the temperature of that volume of air by just 4 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit. The minimum required to evaporate dense fog would require the energy release equivalent to burning hundreds of tons of coal every hour. In a nation engaging in total war, where fuel rationing was so strict that civilians were painting white stripes on their curbs to avoid walking into them in the blackout, the idea of burning millions of gallons of gasoline just to heat up the outdoors seemed like madness. It was logistical heresy. When Hartley proposed the idea to the Air Ministry, the reaction was predictable. The air marshals were skeptical. They were pilots, not engineers. They understood wind, shear, and lift. They did not understand thermodynamics on this scale. They argued that lighting massive fires along a runway would create turbulent updrafts, thermal currents so violent they would flip a landing bomber on its back. They argued that the glare would blind the pilots. They argued that placing miles of pressurized gasoline pipes next to a runway where aircraft frequently crashed was a recipe for disaster. But Hartley had the backing of Churchill, and he had something else: the grim statistics of the crash recovery teams. The project was given the green light under the highest classification of secrecy. The code name was FIDO. Officially, FIDO stood for Fog Investigation and Dispersal Operation. Unofficially, amongst the cynical crews who would later bet their lives on it, it stood for Fog Intense Dispersal of. The engineering challenge facing Hartley and his team was not just about making fire. Anyone can make a fire. The challenge was making a smokeless fire. If you burn gasoline in an open trough, which was the first crude method they attempted, you get a dirty, black, oil-rich flame. You generate heat, yes, but you also generate massive plumes of thick black smoke. If you replace white fog with black smoke, you haven't solved the visibility problem. You've just changed the color of the curtain. Hartley needed a burner system that would ensure complete combustion. He needed a clean, blue-white flame that converted 100% of the fuel into heat and carbon dioxide, with zero particulate matter. To achieve this, the PWD engineers looked to the technology of the humble camping stove, but scaled up to industrial proportions. They developed the Haigill Burner, and later the Hartley Burner. The design was an elegant application of heat feedback. The system consisted of 3 pipes running parallel to the runway. One pipe carried the fuel. The other 2 pipes were the burners. The key innovation was that the fuel pipe was laid above the burner pipes. As the burner pipes were lit, the flames would heat the fuel pipe running above them. This preheated the liquid gasoline until it vaporized into a gas before it even reached the nozzle. When this pressurized gasoline vapor was ejected through the burner holes, it mixed with air and burned with a ferocity and cleanliness that was previously unattainable. It created a wall of smokeless flame. The scale of the infrastructure required to implement this at a single airfield was staggering. This wasn't just a matter of digging a few trenches. It required the construction of a massive subterranean plumbing network that rivaled the municipal water systems of a small city. Let's look at the specifications for a typical Class A bomber airfield installation, such as RAF Gravely. The system required the installation of 20 miles of steel pipe, not lightweight tubing, but heavy-gauge, seamless steel pipe capable of withstanding high pressure. These pipes had to be sunk into concrete trenches running parallel to the main runway, usually 50 yards from the tarmac edge, to ensure the wings of the bombers didn't clip the flames. Feeding these pipes were massive pumping stations, housed in bomb-proof concrete bunkers. These pumps were driven by surplus aircraft engines or massive diesel generators, capable of pushing fuel at a pressure of 100 pounds per square inch. And then there were the storage tanks. A FIDO burn was thirsty. A single landing operation might last only 15 minutes, but the system had to be warmed up, kept running for the duration of the squadron's return, and then shut down. A full burn could consume 100,000 to 150,000 gallons of petrol in a single night. To put that number in perspective, A standard railway tanker car holds about 30,000 gallons. A single night of FIDO operation at one airfield burned through the equivalent of 3 to 5 railway tankers of fuel. This fuel had to be transported to the airfield. The logistics of the war were already strained. The Red Ball Express was burning tires to get fuel to Patton's tanks in France. The Battle of the Atlantic was being fought to bring oil tankers from America. And here was Arthur Hartley, proposing to take that precious, blood-soaked fuel and literally set it on fire in the English countryside. It was an extravagance that only the United States and Great Britain could afford. It was a flex of industrial muscle that the Germans could not comprehend. While the Luftwaffe was grounding planes due to fuel shortages in 1944, the RAF was burning millions of gallons just to change the local weather. The first full-scale test of the system took place in November 1942 at Moody Down. The results were apocalyptic. When the order was given to light up, the airfield crews often comprised of WAF, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, personnel, or ground crew would open the valves. In the early days, men would run along the pipelines with torches soaked in paraffin, lighting the jets manually. It was a scene out of Dante's Inferno. As the burners caught, a low rumble would begin, shaking the ground like a mild earthquake. This was the sound of thousands of gallons of gasoline vaporizing and igniting simultaneously. The rumble would deepen into a roar, a continuous deafening thunder that drowned out the sound of the aircraft engines overhead. The flames would leap up. Initially yellow and smoky, they would quickly settle into the designed operating temperature. As the vaporizer pipes heated up, the flame would turn a fierce, bright transparency. The walls of fire would rise 6 feet, 10 feet, sometimes 20 feet into the air. And then the physics would take over. The intense heat generated by the 2 parallel lines of fire would create a massive thermal updraft. This rising column of hot air would physically push the fog layer upwards. Simultaneously, the heat radiating sideways would raise the air temperature over the tarmac above the dew point. Observers at the test described the scene with awe. One moment, the runway was invisible, buried under a thick gray soup. Then, as the roar of the burners reached its crescendo, a box began to form. It was as if a giant invisible knife was carving a tunnel through the cloud. The fog didn't just fade, it evaporated. Within 10 minutes of ignition, a clear tunnel 100 feet high and the full length of the runway would open up. Above the tunnel, the fog still swirled, illuminated by the orange glow of the fires below. But inside the tunnel, the air was crystal clear. It worked, but proving it worked on the ground was one thing. Proving it to a pilot was another. The psychological barrier was immense. Pilots are trained from day one to avoid fire. Fire on the ground usually means a crash. Fire in the air means death. Now, they were being told to deliberately fly their aircraft, loaded with fuel and perhaps unexploded ordnance, into a tunnel of fire. The first operational test in actual fog conditions occurred on July 17, 1943. The pilot was Flying Officer JBEO Benny Bennett, not to be confused with the Pathfinder leader Doane Bennett, though he was involved in early trials. The visibility was down to 100 yards. The fog was a solid wall. Bennett approached the airfield at RAF Gravely. He could see nothing. His radio operator guided him in. FIDO operational, the tower called. Look for the glow. And there it was. Through the gray cotton wool of the fog, a diffuse orange aura appeared. It grew brighter, sharper. Suddenly, Bennett broke out of the fog and looked down. He later described it as looking into a cross-section of hell. 2 parallel lines of roaring flame stretched out into the distance. Between them, a strip of black tarmac, perfectly clear, lit with the intensity of a football stadium. The turbulence was there, yes. The heat rising from the burners buffeted the wings of the aircraft. But it was manageable. Bennett lined up the nose of his aircraft between the walls of fire. He dropped his landing gear. He committed to the descent. As he flared for landing, the heat was palpable in the cockpit. The noise of the burners drowned out his own engines. But the wheels touched down on dry concrete. He rolled out, braking hard, passing through the tunnel of heat, and turned off the runway. As soon as he taxied clear, the order was given to cut the pumps. The flames died down. The roar faded. And within minutes, the cold, damp fog rolled back in, swallowing the runway as if it had never been there. The concept was proven. Now, it had to be industrialized. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the PWD and the Royal Engineers worked at a frantic pace to install FIDO systems at key emergency landing ground, LE airfields. These were special airfields with extra-long, extra-wide runways, designed specifically to catch the lame ducks, the bombers that were too damaged to make it back to their home bases. 3 massive emergency runways were constructed at Manston in Kent, Woodbridge in Suffolk, and Carnaby in Yorkshire. These runways were 3,000 yards long and 250 yards wide, 5 times the width of a standard runway. And they were lined with the FIDO pipes. The installation at RAF Woodbridge was the crown jewel of the system. When Woodbridge lit up, it was said that the glow could be seen from the coast of Holland. It was a beacon of salvation for every Allied airman in the sky. But the Germans saw it too. The Luftwaffe pilots patrolling the North Sea were initially baffled by the phenomenon. They would see a sudden, intense orange glow appearing on the horizon in England, in the middle of dense fog. Some German intelligence reports initially speculated that it was a new type of city incendiary weapon being tested by the British. Others thought an ammunition dump had exploded. There are anecdotal reports of German night fighters investigating the glow, only to be caught in the sheer thermal violence of the updraft. But for the most part, the Germans simply couldn't understand the scale of the waste. To the German mind, conditioned by years of resource scarcity, where every drop of synthetic fuel was measured, the idea of burning 100,000 gallons of petrol to land a few planes was economically illiterate. They assumed it must be something else. They didn't realize that to the Americans and British, fuel was just a logistics problem, not a scarcity problem. The Allies had the tankers. They had the pipelines, including Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean. They had the luxury of waste. The true test of FIDO came during the Battle of Berlin in the winter of 1943-1944. Was the period of maximum effort for Bomber Command, and the weather was atrocious. On the night of December 16, 1943, known as Black Thursday, Bomber Command launched a massive force of Lancaster bombers against Berlin. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies over England for the return leg. The forecast was wrong. As the bomber stream turned for home, a sudden, dense fog bank rolled across East Anglia. Visibility dropped to near zero across almost every bomber base in the country. The crews, exhausted after 8 hours of flying and dodging flak, arrived home to find their bases blanketed. Panic began to set in. Radios were jammed with calls for help. Aircraft were circling blindly, running low on fuel. Crashes began to occur. A Lancaster of 97 Squadron slammed into a hill. Another crashed into a forest. The order was being prepared to tell crews to bail out. Then, the order went out to the FIDO-equipped stations. Light up. At RAF Gravely, the ground crews scrambled. The valves were opened. The torches were applied. Within minutes, the thermal wall punched a hole through the fog. One by one, the desperate bombers were vectored toward the glow. To the crews of the Lancaster bombers orbiting in the suffocating darkness of December 16, 1943, the sight below was hallucination. Through the dense, wet cotton of the fog, 2 parallel lines of fire appeared, burning with a ferocity that defied the natural order of the English winter. It looked, as one pilot later described it, like the gates of hell opening up to welcome us. But for these men, hell was the only safety left. Inside the cockpit of F for Freddy, the pilot fought the controls. He was tired. His eyes were stinging from the strain of scanning the night sky for German fighters for 6 hours. His fuel gauges were bouncing on the red line. He pushed the nose down, aiming for the center of the inferno. This was the moment of truth for Arthur Hartley's physics. The theory said that the heat would create a stable tunnel. The pilots, however, feared the turbulence. They knew that heat rises. They knew that a fire of this magnitude burning gasoline at a rate that could drain a standard swimming pool in 20 minutes must be generating a thermal updraft of titanic power. They feared that as they crossed the threshold of the runway, the rising air would toss their 65,000-pound bombers around like dry leaves, flipping them into the ground or stalling their wings just as they tried to flare. The pilot lined up. He committed. The Lancaster descended into the FIDO box. The sensation was immediate. The violent buffet that they expected did not happen. Instead, there was a sudden sharp bump, like driving over a curb, and then clarity. The fog vanished. The pilot could see the tarmac. He could see the grass verges, scorched brown by the heat. He could see the individual burner jets flickering. The visibility went from 0 to a mile in a fraction of a second. But there was something else. The noise. Even over the roar of 4 Merlin engines, the sound of FIDO was overwhelming. It was a high-pitched, roaring hiss, the sound of millions of cubic feet of gas expanding under pressure. And the heat. It punched through the plexiglass of the cockpit. For crews who had spent the last 8 hours freezing in unpressurized fuselages at 20,000 feet, shivering in electrically heated suits that barely worked, the sudden blast of warmth was shocking. It was tropical. The bomber flared. The wheels screeched onto the concrete. As the aircraft rolled out between the walls of flame, the crew looked out of the side windows. The flames were higher than the fuselage. They were taxiing through a canyon of fire. At the end of the runway, the pilot turned off onto the perimeter track. He shut down the engines. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant, rhythmic roar of the burners. He opened the side window and looked back. The fog was already closing in behind him, swirling over the runway like water rushing to fill a void. But he was down. He was alive. On that night, a lone Black Thursday FIDO saved dozens of crews who would otherwise have been forced to bail out or crash. It proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the system worked. But making it work once was an experiment. Making it work every night at 15 different airfields across the United Kingdom was an industrial challenge of a different magnitude. It required the mass production of fire. To understand why FIDO was such a triumph of engineering, we have to look at the specific technology of the burner. It wasn't enough to just dump fuel in a ditch and light it. That would produce a lazy, smoky, yellow flame. Smoke was the enemy. If you cleared the white fog only to replace it with black soot, you had achieved nothing. You needed a clean, smokeless burn. You needed complete combustion. The solution was the Haigill Burner, a masterpiece of simple thermodynamics. The design consisted of 3 pipes arranged in a triangle. 2 pipes lay on the ground. These were the burner rails. They were drilled with thousands of tiny holes, spaced 6 inches apart. The 3rd pipe was the evaporator. It was mounted on steel stanchions, suspended a few inches directly above the burner rails. When the system was activated, petrol was pumped into the evaporator pipe first. It traveled down the length of the runway, absorbing the heat from the flames burning below it. This preheating process boiled the liquid gasoline inside the pipe, turning it into a high-pressure vapor. This vapor was then fed back into the burner rails below. Because the fuel was already a gas when it hit the air, it mixed perfectly with oxygen. When it ignited, it didn't burn with a smoky yellow flame. It burned with a fierce, roaring, blue-white transparency. It was the same principle as a camp stove or a blowtorch, but scaled up to a size that could be seen from the stratosphere. The engineering tolerances required to build this were immense. The pipes had to withstand the thermal shock of going from freezing winter temperatures to 1,000 degrees Celsius in seconds. They had to expand and contract without rupturing. The welding had to be perfect. A leak in a pressurized gasoline line next to an open flame would result in a catastrophic explosion that could destroy the runway and any aircraft on it. The installation of these systems required an army of laborers. At RAF Woodbridge, one of the 3 emergency landing grounds, specifically built to recover damaged aircraft, the scale of the FIDO installation was pharaonic. Woodbridge possessed a runway that was 3,000 yards long and 250 yards wide, 5 times the width of a standard RAF strip. It was designed to allow a bomber with shot-away hydraulics, no brakes, and 1 wheel missing to ground loop safely without hitting anything. To equip Woodbridge with FIDO, the Royal Engineers laid over 40 miles of pipe. They built a subterranean storage depot capable of holding 2 million gallons of fuel. The pumping house resembled the engine room of a battleship, filled with massive centrifugal pumps driven by electric motors that drew enough current to dim the lights in the nearby villages. And who operated this fiery beast? Who were the people standing next to the pipes when the order came to light up? They were the FIDO crews. Often, they were W.A. Safen's Auxiliary Air Force personnel. In the popular imagination of the war, the women of the RAF are often pictured in control towers, moving counters on a map or packing parachutes. But in the FIDO detachments, they were frontline industrial combatants. Their job was terrifyingly manual. In the early versions of the system, before automatic electric ignition was perfected, the FIDO lines had to be lit by hand. Imagine the scene. The fog is thick. You can't see more than 10 feet. The order comes from the tower. You mount a bicycle or jump into a jeep. You are carrying a torch, a long pole with an oil-soaked rag on the end, burning with a smoky flame. You ride along the edge of the runway. The petrol pumps have been turned on. You can hear the hiss of the gas escaping from the jets. You can smell the raw fuel vapor, a heavy, cloying scent that hangs in the damp air. You know that the air around you is an explosive mixture. You reach the ignition point. You lower the torch. Whoosh! The flame catches. It races away from you down the line, traveling faster than a sprinting man. The concussion hits you in the chest. The heat is instantaneous. You have to pedal away hard to escape the thermal wave. You ride to the next section and do it again. And again. Until the entire 2-mile length of the runway is a wall of fire. The danger was constant. If a pipe fractured, the liquid fuel would spray out, creating a flamethrower effect that could incinerate anyone nearby. If the wind shifted, the flames could be blown across the taxiways. The ground crews worked in an environment that violated every modern health and safety regulation ever written. They breathed gasoline vapor and soot. They were deafened by the roar. They were baked by the heat and frozen by the fog. But they did it because they knew who was up there. They knew that the low drone they could hear circling overhead was a Halifax with a 19-year-old pilot who was weeping with frustration because he couldn't see the ground. They knew that lighting these fires was the only thing standing between that boy and a grave in the North Sea. This brings us to the economics of the operation. In the cold light of retrospective analysis, Operation FIDO seems like an act of economic insanity. During World War II, fuel was liquid gold. It was the lifeblood of the mechanized armies. Every gallon of high-octane aviation spirit that reached England had to be brought across the Atlantic in a tanker, dodging U-boat wolf packs. Sailors died to bring that fuel to Britain. Ships were torpedoed, broken in half, and sunk in freezing waters to deliver that cargo. To take that precious blood-bought fuel and simply burn it into the open air seemed, to many, like a crime. Let's run the numbers. A single FIDO landing, bringing one aircraft down safely, might require the system to run for 15 to 20 minutes. In that time, a large installation like Woodbridge would consume approximately 30,000 gallons of fuel. A Lancaster bomber holds about 2,000 gallons of fuel for a mission to Berlin. This means that to land one bomber, the RAF burned enough fuel to send 15 bombers to Berlin and back. From a purely accounting perspective, it was a disaster. A cost per landing was astronomical. There were questions raised in Parliament. There were grumbles from the Treasury. There were logistical officers who argued that the fuel would be better spent by Patton S tanks or the fighter squadrons. But this is where the perspective shifts the narrative. We don't look at the cost of the fuel. We look at the cost of the alternative. A Lancaster bomber cost the government £45,000. A trained heavy bomber crew, 7 men, cost approximately £100,000 to train, feed, and equip. But the monetary value was irrelevant compared to the strategic value. By 1944, the RAF was facing a critical shortage of experienced crews. You can build a bomber in 3 weeks at the Ford Willow Run plant. You cannot build a flight lieutenant with 30 missions of experience in 3 weeks. It takes 2 years. When an experienced crew crashed in the fog, the RAF didn't just lose 7 men. They lost the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of hours of combat. They lost the leadership that held the squadron together. They lost the morale of the other crews, who could accept dying by flak, but found it hard to accept dying by bad weather. So, when you do the math, the real math of Total War FIDO was a bargain. If a FIDO burn cost £5,000 in fuel, but saved a £45,000 aircraft and a priceless crew, the return on investment was instant. It was a classic example of the Allied philosophy. Waste material to save lives. It was the exact opposite of the Axis philosophy, which often wasted lives to save material. The Germans, peering across the channel, were baffled. Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes would return with photos of scorch marks running alongside British runways. German intelligence officers analyzed the reports of glows seen from the coast of Holland. They couldn't figure it out. Was it a signaling system? A decoy? A weapon? The truth that the British were simply boiling the sky was outside their frame of reference. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was so starved of fuel that they were towing their fighters to the runway with oxen to save taxiing gas. The idea that their enemy had so much fuel they could afford to burn millions of gallons just to change the local weather was inconceivable. It was a display of logistical arrogance that signaled the end of the war just as clearly as the bombing raids themselves. But FIDO wasn't just used for bombers. As the war moved into its final phase, the system began to play a role in the tactical air war as well. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the German offensive relied entirely on bad weather. Hitler's meteorologists had predicted a period of heavy fog and low cloud that would ground the devastating Allied tactical air power. For the first few days, the plan worked. The American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons were stuck on the ground. The Panzers rolled forward under a blanket of gray. But in England, the FIDO-equipped airfields were open. The RAF used FIDO to launch Mosquito Pathfinders and reconnaissance aircraft when every other airfield in Europe was closed. These aircraft could take off from a clear tunnel in England, fly over the fog-shrouded Ardennes, drop flares, or use radar to find targets, and then return to their fiery sanctuary. It kept the pressure on. It denied the Germans the total immunity they had counted on. Even the weather, their last ally, had been neutralized by American oil and British plumbing. One of the most dramatic FIDO rescues occurred not with a bomber, but with a fighter. A flight of American P-51 Mustangs, escorting a daylight raid, returned to find their base in East Anglia completely socked in. They were low on fuel. They had no instrument landing capability comparable to the heavy bombers. They were single-engine fighters, twitchy and difficult to land even in good weather. The flight leader called for help. He was vectored to a FIDO station. Imagine the view from the cockpit of a P-51. You are sitting in a tiny bubble canopy. You are terrified. The clouds are down to the deck. Suddenly, a hole opens up in the white floor below you. A rectangular canyon of fire. The Mustangs dove for it. One by one, they dropped into the slot. The heat battered their lightweight wings. The updrafts threw them around, but the runway was there. They landed, bounced, and rolled to a stop. As the American pilots climbed out of their cockpits, shaking with adrenaline, they looked at the roaring lines of fire and the British ground crews calmly tending the valves. One American pilot reportedly walked up to the station commander and said, "Sir, I don't know what you're burning in those pipes, but it smells like victory." There were accidents, of course. FIDO was not foolproof. If a pilot drifted off the centerline, he could drift into the flames. There are records of aircraft landing with one wheel in the fire, blowing tires and slewing across the runway. There were incidents where the heat was so intense it melted the duralumin skin on the underside of the elevators. And there was the psychological aspect. Some pilots simply couldn't do it. The instinct to pull away from fire is primal. To deliberately fly a loaded bomber into a fire required a suppression of instinct that some men, already pushed to the breaking point by combat fatigue, could not muster. They would shy away at the last second, pull up into the fog, and be lost. But for the thousands who used it, FIDO was the difference between a telegram to their next of kin and a pint of beer in the mess. By the end of the war, FIDO systems had been installed at 15 airfields in Britain, one in France, at Pinoy, and one in the Aleutian Islands, Kamchatka, for the U.S. campaign against Japan. The system at Manston, on the tip of Kent, was the largest. It had a burn capacity that could clear a fog bank 500 feet deep. It became the primary diversionary airfield for the entire Allied Air Force. If you were in trouble anywhere over Europe, you headed for Manston. You looked for the glow. On VE Day, when the lights went back on all over Europe, the FIDO burners were turned off. The pipes were drained. The roar of the artificial volcano fell silent. The infrastructure was quickly dismantled. Copper and steel were valuable scrap. The farmers wanted their fields back. Within a few years, the only evidence that FIDO had ever existed were the concrete trenches running alongside the crumbling runways of abandoned airfields, overgrown with weeds. But the legacy of Operation FIDO is not in the pipes or the pumps. It is in the statistics of survival. Official RAF records credit FIDO with the safe landing of over 2,500 aircraft during the war. Many of these were in declared emergencies. If we assume an average crew of 7 men per bomber, that is nearly 17,500 airmen. 17,500 men. That is the population of a small town. That is more men than were lost in many major battles of the war. Those were men who went home to their wives, who raised children, who rebuilt the post-war world. They were fathers and grandfathers who existed solely because Arthur Hartley believed he could boil the sky. FIDO was the ultimate expression of the war thesis, that logistics and engineering are the true heroes of conflict. It wasn't a weapon that killed the enemy. It was a machine that saved friends. It was a triumph of waste, a glorious, extravagant, unapologetic waste of resources that demonstrated, with blinding clarity, that the Allies would pay any price to bring their boys home. The Germans had the Tiger tank. They had the V-2 rocket. They had the Me-262 jet fighter. They had technical marvels of destruction, but they didn't have the fuel to fly them. And they certainly didn't have the fuel to burn just to clear a patch of fog. The Allies did. And that, in the end, is why the lights of Europe are burning today.